Hey guys, tonight we are journeying deep into the labyrinthine world of 17th century France. Forget the epic battles and grand treaties for a moment. We're getting right down to the tiny, fluffy, surprisingly perilous matter of your hair. Close your eyes, settle into your coziest spot, and imagine you are standing on a muddy street in Paris. Circa 1675. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, horses, and the faint, unsettling whiff of unwashed velvet. The magnificent Palace of Versailles is newly gleaming, and King Louis XIV, the Sun King, is casting his long, imperious shadow over everything, including, yes, the way you style your bangs. You trudge through the cobblestone alleys, perhaps heading to the market, or perhaps even daring to approach the outer gates of a noble's estate. You feel confident. Perhaps you've spent a few extra sols on a respectable, if modest, new wig, little curled and powdered just so. But you need to be careful. In this meticulously ordered world, the government didn't just worry about taxes and foreign wars. They were deeply concerned with sumptuary laws, rules designed to control who wore what and how they wore it, based entirely on their station in life. You probably won't survive this, not because of a duel or a plague, but because your side part is technically an illegal act of class mobility. The audacity! The Sun King's court was the epicenter of style, setting the global standard for fashion, and everything radiated outward from his personal preferences. And Louis XIV, as a mainstream historical fact, had a notorious, very personal interest in hair, because he himself started going bald relatively young. When the king donned a full, voluminous, cascading wig, the perruque, the rest of the aristocracy, and eventually everyone who wanted to be anyone, had to follow suit. This wasn't just fashion. It was a political statement. The government realized that if they could control the visual signifiers of rank, they could, in essence, control society. Every curl, every ribbon, every inch of human or horse hair became a legally scrutinized component of your identity. You might think it's just hair, but here it was an incredibly visible, incredibly regulated, and often incredibly itchy marker of who you were allowed to be. Now, here's a quirky tidbit to ease your slumber. Some aristocratic women, seeking to emulate the height and volume of the men's towering perruque, would construct elaborate styles known as the fontange. These coiffures could rise 2 or even 3 feet high, requiring wires, ribbons, and, here's the sleepy part, sometimes tiny, hidden bird cages for support. Imagine trying to nap with a small, empty aviary strapped to your head. The practical challenges alone, walking through a low door, riding in a carriage, were immense. But the legal challenge was often simply one of affordability and permissible extravagance. The crown issued edicts, trying to cap the permissible height and material cost, often unsuccessfully. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely about maintaining social order or simply a cynical ploy by the king to try and reduce the massive import costs of luxury silks and real human hair from Italy and Germany. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The street is quieting, the light of the tallow lamps is soft, and you should probably check your wig is regulation size before the night watch passes by.
The night watch does pass by. A couple of fellows in heavy wool cloaks, their faces dimly lit by their lantern. You quickly pull your collar up, hoping your slightly oversized bow, a bit of unauthorized fluff, doesn't catch their attention. As we drift further into the 1670s, you realize the legal landscape of hair is dominated by the periwig, the peruke. It wasn't just a hairstyle, it was an economic engine and a legislative nightmare. The laws surrounding the periwig were surprisingly specific, regulating everything from the hair's origin to its final form. For example, a mainstream historical fact that might shock your modern sensibilities is that the highest quality, most expensive wigs were often made from the hair of plague victims. Why? Because the sudden, localized outbreaks provided large quantities of high-quality, pre-cleaned hair, often from younger, healthier people who succumbed quickly. The sheer volume needed was staggering, fueling a massive industry that the government quickly sought to control through quality and tax regulations. You, as a middle-class merchant, are legally permitted to wear a wig, but it must be made of less luxurious materials, perhaps goat hair or cheap processed sheep's wool. And it certainly cannot achieve the massive shoulder-length volume reserved for dukes and high magistrates. The cost was the legal choke point. If your hair was too obviously expensive or too meticulously styled, it was direct evidence you were flouting the sumptuary laws designed to keep you in your place. Now let's talk about color, because even the hue of your strands became regulated. The favored color for the aristocracy was a shade of ash blonde or light brown, usually achieved through liberal applications of white or gray powder. However, a particularly quirky tidbit is the law governing red hair, which was in some periods viewed with suspicion. It was sometimes associated with lower-class professions, certain trades like dyeing, or even, thanks to lingering medieval superstitions, seen as a subtle sign of witchcraft or an overly passionate temperament. There were edicts in regional parliaments attempting to restrict the use of bright dyes or very noticeable shades of auburn to specific classes, a kind of proto-zoning ordinance for your scalp. Imagine getting fined because your ginger roots are too honest. You might have to switch to a more subdued, legally compliant drab brown just to keep the peace. You feel a soft yawn escaping. It's exhausting just thinking about all this paperwork for a few curls. The sheer impracticality of enforcement leads us to an ongoing academic debate. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these intricate hair laws was actual social control or economic protectionism for the powerful Parisian wig makers' guilds. Every time a law mandated a specific style or material, it essentially guaranteed business for the highly regulated guilds, crushing independent or rural artisans who couldn't meet the strict, officially sanctioned standards. You notice the moon is high now, casting long shadows across your small room. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from the last episode? This feels equally ridiculous, but far more bureaucratic. These were laws designed to be noticed, to constantly remind you of your station in life every time you looked in the expensive, heavily taxed mirror. Sleepily, you adjust your humble nightcap, grateful for the anonymity of bedtime. You are safe from the wig police for now. The morning light, still soft and hazy, filters through your window, and your thoughts turn reluctantly to the outside world and the necessity of visiting your barber. In the 17th century, the role of the person who handled your hair was far more complex and far more legally significant than a modern stylist. They weren't just barbers, they were often barber-surgeons, blending the craft of cutting hair and shaving with a much more serious and sometimes gruesome practice of minor surgery, bloodletting, and dentistry. This dual role created a fascinating legal dilemma, and here is a mainstream historical fact about it. In France, the Company of Barber-Surgeons, later the Academy of Surgery, was constantly locked in legal battles with the more formally educated physicians. The Crown and regional parliaments had to issue specific legal decrees distinguishing their allowed procedures. While a university-trained physician could diagnose and prescribe, the less educated barber-surgeon was legally permitted to perform manual operations, which, yes, included the lancing of boils, setting of simple fractures, and pulling of teeth, often right after giving you a quick trim. The regulations controlled not only what they could do to your body, but also how they could charge for it, and what their professional uniform, and by extension their haircut, had to look like. Their own personal style was a matter of legal oversight, designed to instill public trust, or fear depending on the service. Now, let's consider a quirky tidbit about apprenticeships. Becoming a sanctioned barber-surgeon was a long, legally mandated journey involving years of indenture. The ordinances surrounding this training were incredibly strict. For instance, an apprentice was legally required to live with the master for a set number of years, usually 7, and was often prohibited from growing a beard until he was fully qualified. This law was twofold. It was a mark of submission and servitude during training, and it ensured the public could easily identify a qualified, legal practitioner from a runaway apprentice or a quack. The government was controlling not just the product, your wig, but the provider, the person holding the razor. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic snip, snip, snip of the shears as you imagine this. This close legal control over the guilds leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the guild's control, heavily backed by royal law, actually promoted quality and safety, especially in surgical matters, or whether it was primarily a mechanism for powerful Parisian elites to create a highly lucrative, legally enforced monopoly, stifling innovation and maintaining high prices. Think of it as a 17th century union with the power of the king behind it, legislating your haircut and your appendix removal. As you settle deeper into your pillow, you realize the quiet competence of your barber was entirely due to decades of legal wrangling and royal oversight. The fact that the barber didn't accidentally cut your ear off was less about his skill and more about the fear of the extremely punitive laws governing guild malpractice. You feel the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, a pleasant contrast to the rigid, often brutal legal rhythms of the past.
Our journey now takes a slight detour, drifting away from the highly codified, glittering but strict Parisian court and out into the provinces, where regional fads and local laws created an even more confusing patchwork for your poor head of hair. Remember how strict the Sun King was about standardizing style? Well, regional governors and local parliaments often had their own ideas, creating clashes with the main royal decree. Consider a mainstream historical fact about the regions. While Paris dictated the massive perruque, in certain coastal regions, especially Brittany and parts of Normandy, practical concerns often trumped high fashion. Sailors, fishermen, and workers exposed to the wind and sea found the enormous powdered wigs utterly impractical. As such, local ordinances acknowledging the necessities of the regional economy often permitted men to wear simpler, closer cropped hair, or even local styles, like a small, tight queue or braid that would have been considered hopelessly déclassé or low-class in Versailles. These variations were often codified legally, creating pockets of regional hair autonomy that the crown, while disapproving, eventually had to tolerate for the sake of local peace and commerce. You'd have been wise to check the local coutume, customary law, before booking a barber in Bordeaux. Now, for a quirky tidbit that will soothe you right to sleep. In some rural villages, laws concerning hair were less about class and more about seasonal or religious rites. For instance, in areas near the Pyrenees, there were unwritten but socially and legally enforced rules dictating that unmarried women could not cut their hair past a certain length, and married women had to keep their hair covered in public, sometimes legally penalized if even a wisp escaped their quiff. In these tiny communities, an overly stylish or rebellious hairstyle wasn't just a social faux pas. It was often considered a minor public disturbance, reflecting badly on the entire family, and occasionally incurring small, locally administered fines, perhaps payable in eggs or firewood. It's the kind of law that makes you feel very sleepy because it's so delightfully, narrowly local. This leads directly into another open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the local variance in French law, not just for hair, but for trade, land, and marriage, was a sign of the country's inherent legal diversity and strength, or whether it was a fundamental weakness that Louis XIV, in his push for absolute power, desperately tried and ultimately failed to eliminate. Every regional hair variation represented a tiny crack in the edifice of his centralized power. You can hear the faint sound of a distant bell tolling, reminding you that even in your most remote corner of 17th century France, someone is legislating whether you can wear a braid or not. It's a comforting thought, in a strange historical way, that people worried so much about something so trivial.
As our evening journey gently wraps up, we land on the most powerful concept of all, how a seemingly trivial hair choice became an act of political statement, of compliance or subtle rebellion against the crown's strict mandates. We've seen the rules about who could wear what size of wig, Section 2, and how the power of the guilds was legally enforced, Section 3. But what happens when people intentionally break these silent, hair-related laws? This brings us to a mainstream historical fact that resonates with the whole era, the rise of the Cavaliers in England and their contrast with the French court. While France embraced the long, powdered wig, the English political opposition, the parliamentarians or Roundheads, often favored simple, short haircuts as a deliberate sign of austerity, piety, and rejection of the royal extravagance. This style was a profoundly political statement, visually broadcasting their allegiance. While the French political climate was more restrictive, similar visual battles took place in Paris. Wearing a simple, natural, unpowdered style was technically not illegal, but a quiet, instantly recognizable statement of disapproval for the king's extravagant, debt-fueled reign, a subtle, non-violent form of protest. Now for a final quirky tidbit. After the death of Louis XIV, the oppressive weight of the peruke began to lift, but the laws didn't disappear instantly. The subsequent Regency period saw the rise of the catagan, a simple ponytail or loop of hair tied back at the nape of the neck, often adopted by military officers. Initially, this was an informal trend, but it became so popular that it eventually became required military uniform through official royal ordinances. So, for a time, French soldiers were legally mandated to wear a small, simple ponytail, not because of fashion, but for neatness, uniformity, and control. The government was still legislating your hair, just in a much more practical, less itchy way. This entire episode leads back to our key open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the elaborate, legally backed aesthetic controls of the age of absolutism, from hair to hemlines, actually reinforced the power structure or ultimately undermined it by breeding silent resentment and ridicule among the masses. Did the sight of a massive, legally approved wig inspire awe and obedience, or did it inspire weary contempt? You can almost feel the softness of your own hair now, unbound by the decrees of a 17th century monarch, a small, quiet freedom. You feel yourself drifting, the laws and the wigs and the powdered hair fading away into the warm darkness. The weight of history is lifting from your shoulders. The story of the forgotten laws and the heavy wigs is now complete, and the centuries of strict etiquette and powdered curls are finally giving way to stillness. Let the image of those elaborate, legally sanctioned hairdos just gently crumble into dust. Breathe softly. Feel the quiet stability of your surroundings. There are no more long, winding laws to follow tonight. No more complex rules about who you are allowed to be or how you are allowed to look. Everything that was heavy in the past, the velvet, the wool, the legally mandated horsehair, is now light. You are simply here, safe in the quiet dark. Let the little facts, the quirky historical tidbits, drift away like pieces of fine white powder in the night air. The arguments of the historians, the clashing of the guilds, the disapproval of the Sun King, it's all far away now, a soft, indistinct hum. Just let your body sink into the comfort beneath you. There is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to worry about, only the slow, steady rise and fall of your breath. Just relax. Rest.